Hi there, you guys. I hope you're doing well. I hope you had a good day yesterday, and we have another day in front of us. I want to tell you that yesterday I was on several different phone calls, several different video meetings. One was at the district level, one was at the state level, and one was at the national level. And all these meetings were with other teachers and administrators, and we're all trying to figure out what we can do, what we can contribute to help the education of our students, again, both at the district level, the state level, and the national level. So if there are any students watching this, please be assured that we are all working really hard to try to figure out the best way to reach out to you and also continue your education. In the meantime, we have our poems and our Tuesdays with Morrie, so we're going to keep going with that. So let me take you to today's poem. And today we're going to go back to the Tao Te Ching to look at another selection from the Tao. So the Tao is made up of 81 short, I guess, poems, you would call them, and they're obviously philosophical. And the author is Lao Tzu, and we're going back to ancient China for this. But the one I want to look at today is number 29. So they're all just kind of numbered. They don't have official titles, but let's look at number 29. Do you want to improve the world? I don't think it can be done. The world is sacred. It can't be improved. If you tamper with it, you'll ruin it. If you treat it like an object, you'll lose it. There is a time for being ahead, a time for being behind, a time for being in motion, a time for being at rest, a time for being vigorous, a time for being exhausted, a time for being safe, a time for being in danger. The master sees things as they are without trying to control them. She lets them go their own way and resides at the center of the circle. So again, we have this idea of there is this kind of natural force that is behind the world, and our job is to just kind of not try to control everything. Obviously, in our current situation, you take all precautions that you can, but you ultimately cannot control everything. And so we remain in the center of the circle. And that last line is really interesting because at other parts of the Tao, it talks about like a wheel and there's spokes coming out and the wheel turns, but the center remains still, right? So I think that's the idea of we have all these things kind of swirling around us, but at the center of it, there is this stillness that we can find. And of course, if you're reading this and you feel like this might sound familiar for some reason, it could be because you're thinking of Ecclesiastes from the Hebrew Bible, also called the Old Testament by Christians and Muslims. And so let's take a look at that. Here we are at Ecclesiastes 3. We'll read it. Let's read it. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So there we have two separate cultures saying the same thing, that there are times for pretty much every single thing that we go through in this life. And a lot of it is not easy. A lot of it is difficult. So we're in one of those difficult times. And yet, It's part of the world we live in. And as we saw in the first poem, you can't control everything. So we just have to kind of find peace where we can, maybe in the present moment, maybe within yourself, maybe within nature, maybe within the people that you're with. Just take that quiet time to become centered. And in books, we can always find peace in books. So with that, let's go back to our Tuesdays with Morrie. So here we are again with Morrie, and this is right where we left off yesterday. If you're jumping in at this point, we've been at this for about a week now, so feel free to go back to some of the earlier videos if you want to hear the beginning of this story. But we're about halfway through at this point, so we're going to keep going. It is a winter in my childhood on a snow-packed hill in our suburban neighborhood. My brother and I are on the sled. Him on top, me on the bottom. I feel his chin on my shoulder and his feet on the backs of my knees. The sled rambles on icy patches beneath us. We pick up speed as we descend the hill. Car, someone yells. We see it coming down the street to our left. We scream and try to steer away, but the runners do not move. The driver slams his horn and hits his brakes, and we do what all kids do. We jump off. In our hooded parkas, we roll like logs down the cold, wet snow, thinking the next thing to touch us will be the hard rubber of a car tire. We are yelling, "Ah!" and we are tingling with fear, turning over and over, the world upside down, right side up, upside down. And then nothing. We stop rolling and catch our breath and wipe the dripping snow from our faces. The driver turns down the street, wagging his finger. We are safe. Our sled has thudded quietly into a snowbank, and our friends are slapping us now, saying, "Cool," and you could have died. I grin at my brother, and we are united by childish pride. That wasn't so hard, we think, and we are ready to take on death again. The 6th Tuesday. We talk about emotions. I walked past the mountain laurels and the Japanese maple, up the bluestone steps of Morrie's house. The white rain gutter hung like a lid over the doorway. I rang the bell and was greeted not by Connie, but by Morrie's wife, Charlotte, a beautiful gray-haired woman who spoke in a lilting voice. She was not often at home when I came by. She continued working at MIT, as Morrie wished, and I was surprised this morning to see her. "Morrie's having a bit of a hard time today," she said. She stared over my shoulder for a moment, then moved toward the kitchen. "I'm sorry," I said. No, he'll be happy to see you," she said quickly. "I'm sure—" She stopped in the middle of the sentence, turning her head slightly, listening for something. Then she continued, "I'm sure he'll feel better when he knows you're here." I lifted up the bags from the market, my normal food supply, I said jokingly, and she seemed to smile and fret at the same time. "There's already so much food. He hasn't eaten any from last time." This took me by surprise. "He hasn't eaten any?" I asked. She opened the refrigerator and I saw familiar containers of chicken salad, vermicelli, vegetables, stuffed squash, all the things I had brought for Morrie. She opened the freezer and there was even more. "Morrie can't eat most of this food. It's too hard for him to swallow. He has to eat soft things and liquid drinks now." "But he never said anything," I said. Charlotte smiled. "He doesn't want to hurt your feelings." It wouldn't have hurt my feelings. I just wanted to help in some way. I just wanted to bring him something. "You are bringing him something. He looks forward to your visits. He talks about having to do this project with you, how he has to concentrate and put the time aside. I think it's giving him a good sense of purpose. Again, she gave that faraway look, the tuning in something from somewhere else. I knew Morrie's nights were becoming difficult, that he didn't sleep through them, and that meant Charlotte often did not sleep through them either. Sometimes Morrie would lie awake coughing for hours. It would take that long to get the phlegm from his throat. There were healthcare workers now staying through the night and all those visitors during the day, former students, fellow professors, meditation teachers, tramping in and out of the house. On some days, Morrie had a half a dozen visitors, and they were often there when Charlotte returned from work. She handled it with patience, even though all these outsiders were soaking up her precious minutes with Morrie. A sense of purpose, she continued. Yes, that's good, you know. I hope so, I said. I helped put the new food inside the refrigerator. The kitchen counter had all kinds of notes, messages, information, medical instructions. The table held more pill bottles than ever. Celestone for his asthma, Ativan to help him sleep, naproxen for pain, along with a powdered milk mix and laxatives. From down the hall, we heard the sound of a door open. Maybe he's available now. Let me go check. Charlotte glanced again at my food, and I felt suddenly ashamed. All these reminders of things Morrie would never enjoy. The small horrors of his illness were growing, and when I finally sat down with Morrie, he was coughing more than usual, a dry, dusty cough that shook his chest and made his head jerk forward. After one violent surge, he stopped, closed his eyes, and took a breath. I sat quietly because I thought he was recovering from his exertion. Is the tape on? He said suddenly, his eyes still closed. Yes, I quickly said, pressing down the play and record buttons. What I'm doing now, he continued, his eyes still closed, is detaching myself from the experience. Detaching yourself? Yes, detaching myself. And this is important, not just for someone like me who is dying, but for someone like you who is perfectly healthy. Learn to detach. He opened his eyes. He exhaled. You know what the Buddhists say? Don't cling to things because everything is impermanent. But wait, I said, aren't you always talking about experiencing life? All the good emotions, all the bad ones? Yes. Well, how can you do that if you're detached? You're thinking, Mitch. But detachment doesn't mean you don't let the experience penetrate you. On the contrary, you let it penetrate you fully. That's how you are able to leave it. I'm lost. Take any emotion, love for a woman or grief for a loved one or what I'm going through, fear and pain from a deadly illness. If you hold back on these emotions, if you don't allow yourself to go all the way through them, you can never get to being detached. You're too busy being afraid. You're afraid of the pain. You're afraid of the grief. You're afraid of the vulnerability that loving entails. But by throwing yourself into these emotions, by allowing yourself to dive in all the way, over your head even, you experience them fully and completely. You know what pain is. You know what love is. You know what grief is. And only then can you say, all right, I have experienced that emotion. I recognize that emotion. Now I need to detach from that emotion for a moment. Morrie stopped and looked me over, perhaps to make sure I was getting this right. I know you think this is just about dying, he said, but it's like I keep telling you, when you learn how to die, you learn how to live. Morrie talked about his most fearful moments, when he felt his chest locked in heaving surges, or when he wasn't sure where his next breath would come from. These were horrifying times, he said, and his first emotions were horror, fear, anxiety. But once he recognized the feel of those emotions, their texture, their moisture, the shiver down the back, the quick flash of heat that crosses your brain, then he was able to say, okay, this is fear. Step away from it. Step away. I thought about how often this was needed in everyday life, how we feel lonely, sometimes to the point of tears, but we don't let those tears come because we are not supposed to cry. Or how we feel a surge of love for a partner, but we don't say anything because we're frozen with the fear of what those words might do to the relationship. Morrie's approach was exactly the opposite. Turn on the faucet. Wash yourself with the emotion. It won't hurt you. It will only help. If you let the fear inside, if you pull it on like a familiar shirt, then you can say to yourself, all right, it's just fear. I don't have to let it control me. I see it for what it is. Same for loneliness. You let go, let the tears flow, feel it completely, but eventually be able to say, all right, that was my moment with loneliness. I'm not afraid of feeling lonely, but now I'm going to put that loneliness aside and know that there are other emotions in the world, and I'm going to experience them as well. Detach, Morrie said again. He closed his eyes, then coughed. Then he coughed again. Then he coughed again, more loudly. Suddenly, he was half choking, the congestion in his lungs seemingly teasing him, jumping halfway up, then dropping back down, stealing his breath. He was gagging, then hacking violently, and he shook his hands in front of him. With his eyes closed, shaking his hands, he appeared almost possessed. And I felt my forehead break into a sweat. I instinctively pulled him forward and slapped the back of his shoulders, and he pushed a tissue to his mouth and spit out a wad of phlegm. The coughing stopped, and Morrie dropped back into the foam pillows and sucked in air. You okay? You all right? I said, trying to hide my fear. I'm okay, Morrie whispered, raising a shaky finger. Just wait a minute. We sat there quietly until his breathing returned to normal. I felt the perspiration on my scalp. He asked me to close the window. The breeze was making him cold. I didn't mention that it was 80 degrees outside. Finally, in a whisper, he said, I know how I want to die. I waited in silence. I want to die serenely, peacefully, not like what just happened. And this is where detachment comes in. If I die in the middle of a coughing spell like I just had, I need to be able to detach from the horror. I need to say, this is my moment. I don't want to leave the world in a state of fright. I want to know what's happening, accept it, get to a peaceful place, and let go. Do you understand? I nodded. Don't let go yet, I added quickly. Morrie forced a smile. No, not yet. We still have work to do. All right, you guys, that's a good spot for today. So I hope you have a good rest of the day and see if you can get to that spot. And actually, this chapter talked about the same exact thing, the ability to, regardless of everything that's going on and all of your emotions, hopefully that talk about feeling your emotions fully reminded you of Rumi's The Guest House, which talks about that exact same thing. But then at the core of it all, there's this space where you're detached and you don't let the emotions control you, but you feel them and you acknowledge them. And then you're at this kind of peaceful place at the very center, at the very bottom of it all, that is kind of your true self, if you can get to it. It's always there, though, for you. So I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Enjoy.